Achtung! Welcome to We Have Ways, and
it just sounds really good to hear it in German.
It does actually nearly a year to allow ourselves the full Achtung. We are at the National Army Museum again on the Royal Hospital Road in London's fashionable Chelsea, and we are in the archive with Dr Peter Johnston, who is the archivist here at the National Army Museum, and this is terribly exciting because.
He's got some bits out for us.
We've got stuff, documents, historical artifacts, items, and Peter, what you got for us here?
Well, yeah, I mean, just in case the 2,700 things we've got on display aren't enough, I thought I'd actually get some specific things relating to Germany. You mean I listen to the podcast a lot. It's great to be on it, and you guys often talk about the war and the progress of the war and how that goes. And I thought maybe we get a few things out to look a little bit about the aftermath of that and what happens afterwards. Because obviously, as Montgomery said on the 8th of May, we've won the German war, but now we have to win the peace. And the Second World War doesn't really end on the 8th of May 1945, certainly not in Europe anyway.
When does it end?
Well, technically, obviously, with the 15th of August and VJ Day. But actually, the repercussions go on much longer than that. And I think it purely a question of it ends if I am able to do take a historian's prerogative and say, it depends on who you ask and at what point.
I'd say it ends when Russian tanks leave Poland in the late 80s, early 90s.
Of course, Russian tanks don't leave Germany until the mid-90s.
Yeah, well, there we are.
So perhaps even later than that.
And NATO's still in Germany. So you could say we're still occupying Germany. Anyway,
it's a very British occupation.
Like you say, it depends. So what have you got for it? What we've got for us here?
Purely looking at that concept of aftermath and everything that happens following the British breakthrough into Germany, and then the weeks and couple of months of fighting that go on afterwards, is everything that's going to follow that declaration of peace that comes out. And obviously, for the British and 21st Army Group, they're transformed almost overnight. They go to bed being a lean, mean fighting machine, and then they wake up and have to be something incredibly different, completely different. They become occupiers, they become governors, and they have to become builders. So one of the things I've got out to really illustrate that is this map of Hamburg, which represents the bomb damage. And the irony being that this is years and years of RAF and Allied efforts to reduce the German.
Well, we were talking about Operation Gomorrah just the other day, and you look at this, and obviously it doesn't take a rocket science to work out that the red bit is the stuff that got flattened, and the blue stuff is still around. But
I'd say you look at 15% of this map is probably blue buildings, and the rest of it is red, and I'm assuming that's bombed out, fire damage, destroyed.
Exactly, and completely unusable. And so for the British, this Hamburg became the capital, really, of the British military government.
Yeah.
And so this city that they'd reduced to rubble, they were then going to have to quite literally rebuild. I mean, obviously the most famous example of what the British do in Germany in the aftermath of war is the Volkswagen factory at Wolfsburg, which, they pretty much rebuild from the ground up, get that running again, and become major suppliers of the raw materials such as steel, but as much as anything, they also become customers. They are buying Volkswagen cars to use in Germany and in Austria in the commission there. So all of this is very much part and parcel of it. But
just bought one this week, actually.
Have you?
Yeah. But golf. Know where you stand.
But of course, there's also there's a darker undercurrent to this stuff as well, because as part of that progress up through northern Germany, and in fact, as part of the drive up towards Hamburg, obviously the British have encountered Belsen. We will have recently we've talked about Holocaust Memorial Day, which obviously is focused on Auschwitz, but there's Belsen as well, which is really the British first contact with the elements of the Holocaust. Belsen's not a death camp in the same way that Auschwitz is, but it's still obviously a horrendous and grim place.
I visited it a long time ago, but I'm right to think of the Jews that were at Belsen at the time were being sort of held in a kind of limbo because Himmler was seeking to negotiate using their lives and to say to the Allies, look, here are some Jews you can have. See, we don't murder them all, because he actually believed that the world was run by Jews, and that would actually be a way of currying favour. I mean, it's also essentially unbelievable that how totally anti-Semitism was. Actually, they really believed it. The conspiracy theories and everything, and that's who was at Belsen, wasn't it?
It's a mixture. I mean, there's prisoners of war who are at Belsen who've been marched out of the as the Soviets have advanced from the east. They've been marching prisoners of war away from that front too, and moving them forward. Belsen had actually been a bit of a, if it doesn't sound too banal a phrase, awful a phrase, it's almost as a show camp, as a way of saying, look, where we're actually settling and moving Jews to is really not that bad. They have barracks, they have fields and this sort of thing. And it had been part of the propaganda. But obviously towards the end of the war, the Hungarian guards and the SS who are there are really just letting people die. Typhus is rampant and it's horrendous. And the British who encounter that are just completely unprepared for what they find. The humanitarian mission they launch in the middle of still fighting an active campaign is one of the great stories of the war that sits alongside
Well, among
this.
the first to reach there were 8th Armour Brigade, yes, I caught up with Stuart Watson, who obviously we've had on the podcast. And actually, one of the questions I asked him, because obviously yesterday was the anniversary of the relief of the siege of Leningrad, but also the liberation of Auschwitz. So we were talking about this, and I said to him, how much did you know beforehand, about what you were going to get? And he said, well, we had absolutely no idea. We just couldn't believe it. He said, literally, we got to Belsen. He said, I didn't actually go into Belsen, but of course, we knew exactly, in no time they knew exactly what Belsen meant and what was being discovered there. And he said, we just couldn't quite believe it.
Well, because I met Lionel Hardman, who was the rabbi who did the funeral rites there in the immediate aftermath. And if you go there, there's these enormous graves that say, here lie 4,000. And he said that he was in the mess, and a load of guys came in and basically couldn't look him in the eye. It's the first he knew of the camp.
Right.
A load of guys came in, couldn't look him in the eye, and he goes over and said, what's the problem? They said, we're sorry, Rabbi, it's your people. And he had to go and find out what was going on. When he got to the camp, he said, I saw the dead walking because the people were so thin.
I mean, I haven't got them out because they are absolutely horrific, but some of the photographs of the camp and them burying the bodies. I mean, Richard Dimbleby, who's the BBC correspondent, goes in soon afterwards, and he says simply, that day at Belsen was the worst day of my life.
Yeah. So what have you got in the archive to show us?
So we have
relating to Belsen?
We have various accounts of the archive. So here is actually an account from the 8th Middlesex, which talks about them seeing Belsen in the aftermath. They call it Belsen concentration camp, the final degradation, and this is representative of really how Belsen absolutely hardens British attitudes to Germans. Really in those weeks since they crossed the Rhine, they've been taking town after town, and people have begun to feel very sorry for the German people. They'd seen the rubble, they'd seen the aftermath, they'd advanced through places like Cleve, which had been completely smashed up. And then Belsen, they then encounter Belsen, and then suddenly there is this change and turn, and this idea about, well, how can you possibly say you didn't know what was going on? How could you not smell the camp? Because the town of Bergen is not that far away.
Well,
I'm going to read a bit of this, actually. This is amazing.
Go on,
It goes, at Belsen, under the arc lamps and behind the wire of that grey-hutted camp amid the pine forest, men who followed the vile, bestial Nazi creed sought to debase the human being. Surely and coldly by starvation, by a devilish denial of the barest necessities of life, by the confiscation of the elemental privacies, herding hundreds into a hut, they have forced their victims down to a way of life lower than that of the animal. Wow. That's quite something.
Absolutely. And it meant that British attitudes sort of reached a stage where, it actually says it in this document as well, that the Germans they got what they deserved.
Yep.
And now it's a question of almost of punishment. And actually, we're very familiar with the Nuremberg trials, obviously, but it's the Belsen trial that takes place pretty soon afterwards. And here's a pass that's actually given to a young woman from the ATS, so she can go sit in the public gallery and watch it take place. That was the first trial that used video evidence, because they broadcast the documentary the British Army made of Belsen camp in that, as they tried the camp commandant, some of the guards in particular.
That's in October of 45, so it's admit name, and then it's to War Crimes Court, Lüneburg, 1st of October 45, stamped and signed in. So the British are running their own local war crimes trials, aside from the sort of big. I mean, they're show trials in a way, the Nuremberg trials, aren't they? Arguably.
So a friend and neighbour of mine is called David Bernstein, and David's father had the first cinema chain, he and his brothers, Sidney Bernstein. And in the war, he was, part of the kind of British Army film unit, and was sent into Belsen and shot all this film footage, and then turned it into a much bigger thing. And the idea was to shoot this film footage, they put in cinemas all through Germany. So those who were kind of wheeled out in front, to actually see it, all the people around Belsen were wheeled out, but everyone in Germany could then see this film and understand it in cinemas, and they'd be forced to watch this film. And as Sidney Bernstein was making this movie, so he suddenly thought, actually, there's a bigger piece here. So started getting footage from the Americans, started getting footage from the Russians, the Soviets as well, and turning it into it. And then in October, they'd spent their disgust and they'd realised that actually kind of ramming their noses in it wasn't going to help kind of pick up Germany again. So they abandoned the whole thing, and it was eventually found, about 10 years ago. I'm sorry to mention this again, Peter, but in the Imperial War Museum at Volz. and they got the funding to finish it, and it was almost complete. They just hadn't finished editing the final reel, but they had the kind of script for the commentary and all the rest of it, and they put it back together and shown it out, and it is a film that you only absolutely need to see once.
Yeah.
It is horrific. It really is just absolutely unbelievable. And the shots of Belsen are, they're not quite HD, but they're not kind of grainy black and white. This is properly vivid, and it's really.
How long did
really
this
disturbing.
feeling last, though? With because obviously the idea that all Germans must be punished, they must have all known that you can't sustainably occupy a country if you're in a sort of state of, I suppose, vindictive anger. You can't do that for long without turning population against you, can you?
Well, yes and no. The British occupation in Germany actually lasts until 1955, the formal occupation, the legal occupation. But the sense, some people never let go of that. Don't forget the people that make up the occupying forces of the British are the people that have fought from Normandy. I've actually got this photo album here. This is from a guy called James Sale, who was in the city of Yeomanry, the sharpshooters. And he'd fought from North Africa. He'd fought into Italy, and he fought his whole way into Germany. And these are shots of the immediate aftermath of the war. And there's cocktail parties in requisitioned buildings. There's some shots of the ruins. This photo is amazing. This is a photo of what was called Operation Barleycorn, and that was actually a plan by later Field Marshal Gerald Templer, who was so significant in the founding of the National Army Museum, to basically get the disbanded Wehrmacht out and into the fields and bring in the harvest. And so they're all brought out of their internment camps, released into the fields, turned into farmers, and then brought back in again to just try and help and feed this population. Because exactly as you were saying, how do you maintain that attitude? Well, the British weren't going to let the Germans starve.
No.
And there's a particularly brutal winter in 46, 45 and 46,
They all were
and 46
in the
and 47. And so there is a sense of pity for the local Germans.
You've the same thing as well, though, because there's hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war in the UK at the same time who are working on farms, and so you've got this very peculiar sort of dynamic back in Blighty, as it were, where you've Germans doing the same thing. It's also, it's quite strange, some of this.
It is, and they're in Canada as well. Of course, the desire to not surrender to the Soviets means there's been a huge influx of military personnel into the British zone. Some estimates suggest 1 million more people came in. And you've got a population of about the equivalent of a population of about 20% more than was there pre-war, trying to occupy about 30% of the housing that's left in some areas.
Because the housing's all been destroyed.
Precisely. As well as trying to then quarter the 21st Army Group and the British Army of the Rhine. But you've also got the denazification trials that are going on as well.
Yeah.
And the British process about 2 million cases in their zone of denazification. And that includes looking at people who are obviously bad. It looks at people who are suspected to be bad, and then people who also have what they call the Perselschein, to whitewash their records, who have someone who will stand up and say, well, actually, no, this person sheltered me from the Gestapo, or this person looked after me and stuck their neck out when they didn't have to. The British are actually, I think, a lot more pragmatic in their approach to denazification, certainly than the Americans. And there are stories that in Berlin. This is actually a map of Berlin. In Berlin, there's in the files you can see, in the files held in National Archives, there are accounts of saying, well, we know that Herr Schmidt, who runs this cafe, was a Nazi, but at the same time, he runs a really good cafe, and if we close it down, then the troops will have to go somewhere else, and they'll spend their money in a different zone, so really we should just let them keep it open. So there is this pragmatic sense, and then obviously, of course, what you have is the looming and increasing threat of the Soviets, which, particularly after the Berlin blockade and the airlift that comes, it becomes obvious that that political expediency that had led the Western Allies and the Soviets to sort of park their ideological differences once Germany's been defeated, that those rapidly fall
Well,
away.
I've been reading. Luke Daly Groves has written a lot about this quite recently because he's got the book about Hitler's death, and then he's written some other stuff about what was going on with various secret things that keep changing their names. So you can't say MI6, you can't say Secret Service because they keep changing their names all the time at this point. Various committees and all that sort of thing discussing. Well, you know what? We can arrest everyone and throw everyone in prison, but then we don't have a functioning country anymore. Because after all, I mean, the remarkable thing about Berlin is the town planners that Speer was dealing with before the war, and then during the war, when in fact the Allied bombing raids enabled Speer to clear parts of Berlin that he was planning to clear to build Germania.
Yep.
Right, and there's a period of the bombing where Speer's basically going, well, thank God for that, because I wasn't going to have, we were going to have to knock that block of houses down, and that was going to cause us a real problem. Blah blah blah. Those town planners then go on to be
the rebuilders,
the people who rebuild the city.
I mean, it's interesting because my great mate Guy Walters, I mean, he did this book called Hunting Evil, about post-war Nazi hunting, and he always says that it should have really been called Not Hunting Evil, because actually the number of people that were kind of brought to heel was really, in the big scheme of things, comparatively small. And one of the examples he cites is the Gestapo team that kind of shot Roger Bushell, the Great Escaper, and the guy who actually puts the bullet in the back of the head is a kind of very much a junior functionary who has got nice kids and family and all the rest of it. And really, in the big scheme of things, he's not that much of a Nazi bastard. I mean, he is, but he isn't, if you see what I mean. He's nothing like as bad as the guy who says, put the bullet in the guy's head. Yeah. And he really, at that particular moment, he doesn't have any choice. I mean, Roger Bush was going to be killed, whatever. And what do you do? So he gets hanged. He gets hanged. And eventually the guy who orders this Gestapo functionary to do the actual shooting eventually gets caught. By that stage, it's kind of 1948, and everyone's just kind of sort of lost energy and can't be bothered anymore, and realising that actually these people could be quite useful to recruit for MI6 or whatever it might be. And he just gets away with it. And this is happening over and over and over and over again. And you certainly see by the late 1940s that the whole kind of hunting Nazi thing has just run out of steam.
It's the most extraordinary photo on this album.
Yes.
There's two pictures. German youths being beaten in front of children of their own age as an example for stealing from British troops. And there's literally someone with his trousers down being thrashed.
And that's it. I mean, the British were the sole authority. They made the law. They went where they want. I don't know if you've ever seen the film of Defeated People.
No.
It's available on YouTube, actually. It's an American film, but it was shown in British cinemas as well. And it basically explained that the British were going to have to stay in Germany to rebuild it, because after the First World War and the victory and Versailles, the terms of defeat had not been enforced enough on the Germans, and that had allowed the rise of Nazism. Montgomery, of course, had served in that original British army on the Rhine in the 20s. And so for him, when he came in, he was very clear and adamant, the terms of this defeat have to be enforced, and we're going to do that through a variety of ways, one of which is through denazification, one of it is through redemocratization. But then, of course, there was this strange thing where Montgomery didn't want anybody talking to the Germans, his non-fraternization rules, which, after some...
fall apart pretty quickly.
Well, some rampant cases of VD, become pretty obvious that no one's paying any attention in the first place.
Yeah.
But at the same time, going back to that map of Hamburg, if you're going to rebuild that, the people who are going to do it are the Germans.
Yeah.
The people who are going to be serving you in the mess, the people who are going to be helping you run the police, are all Germans.
Yeah.
And so the concept of non-fraternization becomes
impossible.
It becomes impossible.
It's impossible.
And then on top of that, of course, as the Soviets are taking over, you've got this desire of saying, well, if we really grind these guys into the dust and we take away any semblance of hope, what's to stop them just having a revolution and going over to the Soviet side? At which point, then there's a real concern about moving that border not across the Weser to the Rhine or even beyond. Yeah. And so that greater geopolitical narrative begins to take over. And that's where you begin to see the rehabilitation of Germany as a country. But don't get me wrong, it takes a long time. I spoke to when I was writing my book and for our forthcoming exhibition here about the British Army in Germany since 1945, I spoke to a guy who did his national service, and he said, I hated the Germans. I was raised by grieving women, and I hated them. He'd lost his father, he'd lost an uncle, he'd lost a grandfather in the First War. So at grassroots level, these attitudes are harder to shift. But there's a definite push from above that actually it's time to not necessarily let bygones be bygones, but there are bigger battles to fight.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you so much. And we're going to take a short break now. We'll be back in a second. Welcome back to We Have Ways. We're here at the National Army Museum with Dr. Peter Johnston, who has been taking us through items from the archive. And in the first half of this podcast, James has had to nip out. So and he doesn't really know anything about this next bit, but I do, right? So what we're going to do is we're here to talk about Berlin after the war, because after all, as we said in part one, the war doesn't end in 19 May, or the consequences of the Second World War. I mean, even it's too soon to say, isn't it? You could argue what those are and where those will end. And so what we have here, Peter's got in front of us here from the archive, is a map of Berlin. And it's marked 23rd of August 1960, East Anglian, the Anglians, 1st Battalion East. So this is occupied Berlin before the wall goes up, but with effectively an internal border. And the 3 powers, or the 4 powers, depends on how you look at it. Does France count?
Bien sûr.
Yeah, of course it does. And how they've divided up the city. So take me through this map.
Yeah, of course. And, this map belonged to the Royal Anglians, and you can actually see where they've written Viking land, which is their area of the British zone that they've occupied up here towards Spandau, which is quite fun. But, this very much is a legacy of the Second World War, the occupation of Berlin. And Berlin was a divided city. It was occupied territory. We're very familiar with the establishment of West Germany. We all know West versus East Germany from the annals of sport and that sort of thing. But actually, West Berlin was entirely separate. West Berlin was not part of West Germany.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So the military government that was established in 1945 remained.
Yep.
And carried on going. And this was a real hangover from the war. In many ways, this is where the end of the Second World War had had stood still a little bit. And on this map, this is before the wall goes up. You can see the division between the British and the American zones. This is the British zone up here. And this is 17th of July Strasse down along here, which is where the British have their victory parade in July 1945. Charlottenburg, or Grossi Charlotti, as the Brits nickname it, scene of Machery's famous bathtub later on to the Cold War, which will mean a lot to your listeners who lived that Cold War warrior lifestyle. But and the Grunewald, Ruhleben, Gatow, where so many people would have come in and out of. All of this is before the wall goes up. And before then, movement between the zones, it was a little bit more challenging, but it was relatively easy. Yeah. Obviously, after the wall goes up, you can pretty much see the red line where this goes along, and Berlin is sealed off from the outside and becomes a real island in the Soviet Sea. This is where Tempelhof is, obviously, which is the great that great sort of National Socialist edifice, the longest consecutive brick building in the world, or something when it's built.
Yes, something like that.
And still is, because that thing's not falling down anytime soon. But and these great monuments and these great places are all very much brought into what British life is. And yet, despite the fact the Cold War is in a pretty deep freeze.
Yes.
In 1960. Berlin has already been blockaded, and then the Berlin airlift has successfully relieved that. And also, crucially, shown the Allied willingness to stand for Berlin and not roll over, which means that the local people in West Berlin really like the Allies. They're very happy to have them, and they're happy to continue to pay to have them there, because everything the British do is on the West Berliners in their zone, which is why they have great housing, they have great food, they have great training facilities, and they base themselves out of the Olympic Stadium. So it's a pretty good place to be.
It's the strangest existence militarily, because you're surrounded. You're a tripwire at best. I mean, maybe they won't even bother with you. If the push comes to shove, it's going to all be about the Fulda Gap anyway, isn't it? And if the Soviets do attack, it's probably going to be somewhere else. Why bother?
Well, I mean, if they're going to take anywhere, they're going to take Berlin purely from a symbolic perspective.
Because this is the era of tanks on Friedrichstrasse. There's famous photographs of standoffs with American tanks, 50 yards from Russian tanks, and what's going to happen next. Cold War encounters, isn't it?
Absolutely, and I mean the British have their own version of that as well. I think at Gatow, which is the airport where people begin to fly in and out of increasingly. The wall at Gatow is not a wall; it's a chain link fence. And the joke is that that's because it'll be very easy for the Russians to drive through when they attack, and they actually drive onto the British airfield to stop any kind of resupply from the air. Which obviously have been so significant in the Berlin airlift. So you are literally staring at this. The British have the ruins of the Reichstag in their zone, and there's an observation post that goes up there that can look over the wall, see the Brandenburg Gate and everything behind it, and that desolate wasteland and the death strip as it.
Yeah.
Because obviously, the wall develops over time. It doesn't just go up.
Yes,
as we all remember
It starts off as a sort of rather crudely concreted wall, doesn't it, with some barbed wire on it. If they mark it out on the night. It's a parish boundaries, isn't it? So it's the most extraordinary thing, the Berlin Wall. I mean,
and it's a foot inside the Soviet zone.
Yeah.
Because again, it's this sort of weird. We're at war, but there's no reason why we can't be civil view, which is we're not going to seem to be provoking anybody. So we're not going to build a wall into the Allied territory because that is a provocation.
Yeah.
So we'll build it on our side because. The Soviet zone is the Soviet zone, and we can do
whatever
we
like
want.
in the Soviet zone. Because I saw it in like 1984, I think, on a cadet camp where we went to Germany, and we were taken to see the internal border, and we didn't wear our uniforms because it was we'll end up in propaganda as child soldiers. And something. Well, okay, fine, but we are child soldiers if you want to put it like that, And I remember the it would have been a corporal who was looking after us. There was a ditch, and he said, "That's the border." That's the border our side. That's our marking of the border, that ditch, and then there's a stretch, and there was an open stretch, and then there was the fence, and and two goons in a thing watching us from the other side of the wire. But I mean, this the other thing. If people have been to Berlin, you go to Checkpoint Charlie, you go to Friedrichstrasse, and there's that stretch that's sort of a kilometre of wall where they've left it kind of intact, and then there's the stretch with all the graffiti on it. Those now, I think, what is it? It's 30 years later, isn't it? Feel like kind of tourist items and features now, rather than a very, very real, very like. And I remember the border strip being incredibly imposing and real. You'd read about it, you'd sort of seen it on the telly, but that it actually really physically existed. It's the most extraordinary thing, and direct legacy of the Second World War and the way the politics collapsed in on itself after the war.
It did, and yet, and in some ways, it didn't, because the Soviet, one of the big Soviet war memorials is in the Tiergarten, which is in the British zone.
Yes.
I
need to ask you about that because having been there's a pair of, and the thing is, it's not guarded anymore, is it? They've stopped. So there were guys goose stepping there. There was a flame for the Eternal Soldier. There's a pair of T-34s, a couple of artillery pieces. It's sort of it's what you'd expect from a Soviet war memorial, but it's 300 meters from the Brandenburg Gate, and the wall was this side of the Brandenburg Gate, as it were. That's the British side of it, So what's going on there? How does that war memorial survive?
So obviously, because the Soviets had taken Berlin, and they won the Battle of Berlin and occupied the city before the British and 7th Armoured got there, they decided where they were going to build their memorials, and for them that location, the Tiergarten, was sort of a strategic place, and where they launched the attacks on the Reichstag, and which is only a few hundred meters to the north, and all of this.
And it's politically significant where it is, because the Brandenburg Gate is after all a victory arch, and you've got the
Victory Monument,
the Victory
down
Monument. Yeah, exactly. So it's that's where you put it, between the two big German victory things going. That both of them basically.
But obviously, then once the wall goes up, there's a sense of, well, what are we gonna do? We don't want to ban access to this because then we're seen as being hostile.
Yeah.
So we're going to maintain it. So the Soviets would come in and they'd guard it, and the British would escort them in. And then because that's a very unpopular memorial for all the reasons that we know about what the Russians do in Berlin and elsewhere in Germany, it's nicknamed the monument to the unknown rapist by some. The West Berliners try and vandalise it, and they throw things at it, and they try and smash it. So the British then are in this strange position where they're protecting the West Berliners against the Russians, but they're protecting the monument from the West Berliners. And they're protecting the Russian soldiers from the West Berliners. And there's this it's one of these strange sort of rituals and farces, if you will, of deterrence. But it's there. And obviously Spandau is the big one, maintaining access to Spandau on the four-party system where everyone takes a turn to guard him.
Turn to guard Hess, yeah.
But if he's got to go into hospital, a doctor of every single country has to be summoned. and brought in. And so obviously later in his life, as his health began to deteriorate, that happens more and more. And so you have Russians being brought in, you've got Russians being brought in to guard Hesse while he's in there, and all this sort of thing. And,
I tried to pitch a sitcom about the people who have to guard Hesse, because they're in jail, they're trapped, and they're trapped in the conventions, and they're trapped in the Cold War, and they can't escape. A friend of mine told me that Hess would sit on an exercise bike and he had to blow a hairdryer in his face so he could imagine that he was on a bike outdoors. I mean, I don't know if that's true. That sounds like a Squaddy's tall tale, but I like it.
I don't know, but you almost want it to be true, don't you?
Let's say it's true.
I mean, I think that subject of squaddy humour is really important, because obviously what do British soldiers do? They laugh in the face of the blackest of things, and the wall is a pretty dominant, imposing thing. The threat of what happens if the Russians choose to attack, because it's really important to remember that throughout the Cold War period, the British strategy was always about defence and then counter-attack. It was never about attacking, whereas Soviet strategy was all about attacking.
Yeah.
And that means that, for the British knew that if the Russians would attack, they wouldn't last very long. You're talking 48 hours tops, and that's probably out in the zone, let alone in Berlin. There is a plan to relieve Berlin called Live Oak, which isn't actually shelved until 1990. It's sort of rehearsed. It's farcical. It's never going to work. Yeah. Run an armour brigade up the Autobahn with the Third Shock Army coming the other way. It's good luck to whoever tried it, but fortunately no one ever has to. But for the British soldiers in Berlin, the wall becomes a bit of a fascination, because obviously they're professionals and they want to be there. And this is where it's going to be. This is the centre of the world for them, from their perspective. And so there's lots of jokes and there's laughter. You try and provoke the Russians on the other side. There's some fantastic stories. And in fact, in our exhibition, you'll get to hear it. But, where they basically bring two young officers in to one of the battalions that's doing its tour in Berlin. They show them round, and then they bring up an unmarked car, nab them off the street, throw them in the back, stick hoods of them, drive them round and round and round, dump them in a cellar, and then one of the Julia, Julia's brilliant. Julia then just shouts at them in Russian for about 2 hours, pretending to interrogate them in this random cellar. And after they've had enough and they've sort of completely broken down and they're telling them everything they need to know about where all the British troops are and everything they know about the defence of the West, they then reveal it was all a big joke and take them up to the mess.
Welcome to Berlin.
Welcome to Berlin. Yeah.
Amazing. Well, gosh. We've gone right off our Second World War piece here, but it doesn't matter, does it? Look at this whole thing. I was 1990. I was what? 20. I was 22 in 1990 when it all ended. When this all ended, so I very much remember growing up, with Threads and General John Hackett's Third World War and all that, and my father being a territorial cold warrior and going off to Germany and doing exercise and stuff like that. So this whole picture is it is also another reason why I'm interested in the Second World War, because how on earth do you end up with all this? Some of it's some of it's performative. As much as anything else, isn't it? It's literal saber rattling, isn't it?
It's saber rattling within reason. So it's pushing the boundaries. It's constant pushing the envelope. It's constant testing and pressing. And the way back in the British zone and the area there, they were training for not a war but the war.
Yeah.
Because about 48 hours was life expectancy. In the 50s, of tank commanders, life expectancy is a bit lower. It's about 36.
Yeah.
And if John Kisley, who wrote that great book about Norway, the Norway campaign. We'll bring back to the Second World War with John. I interviewed him when I was writing my book as well, and he said, we knew that we'd probably die, but we were going to damn well stand and fight.
Yeah.
And we were going to bring glory to the battalion before we were invariably wiped out.
Take as many with them as they could.
And that is very much the mentality and the attitude of the time. Everything was about preparing for this. And one of the reasons why I think people loved living in Berlin for so long was because Berlin still had that, even after the National Socialist period, it still had that Weimar freedom, really sort of anything goes, experimentation. And, the impending doom of the wall, it's sort of just brought that around for a new generation. It was a really young city because obviously if you lived in West Berlin, you didn't have to do military service.
That's
so
right,
lots of people are moving into West Berlin from elsewhere.
Kreutzfeld's full
Germany.
of hippies and peaceniks.
Bowie rocks up in there as well.
Bowie and all that sort of thing.
And so it's got this really burgeoning art scene and everything like that. And, it is so radically different from anywhere else. Ultimately, that's why soldiers join the army. It's to go to different places and experience different things. And Berlin offered that in abundance in the Cold War. And I have to say, everybody I've spoken to, and I must have been about 150, 200 hours of interviews for this project. Those who served in Berlin, hands down, all claim it as their own, as their favourite. And that's true of both soldiers, but also their spouses. Because don't forget, there's families that live in here as well. This is not just soldiers; it's their families too. And the families used to go through the wall. It was great. You could go through the wall on a coach. You could buy. You had enormous spending power because the exchange rate was so good.
You had to spend it all, though, didn't you?
Yeah, you sort of had to spend it all.
But so they could get their hands on your Deutschmarks.
But they use, and they've got BAFs, British Armed Forces vouchers, the special like monopoly money the British Army used. That lasts in Berlin way longer than it lasts in the rest of the zone. These relics of the Second World War and then the immediate occupation really do live on in Berlin in particular. And it is a bit, as I say, it's a bit of a time warp.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for talking about this and showing us some stuff in the archive. This exhibition about the British Army in post-war Germany, when does that start?
It's going to open on the 9th of May, so VE Day,
Brilliant.
The weekend.
Oh, superb.
And it very much exactly, we're going to hear all about, that victory there's accomplished in Europe. And then everything after that comes after this, because, it's not the end of the story. In fact, it's just the beginning.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Peter. Thanks for listening, everyone. Cheerio.